Welcome. This is the Student Learning Objective SLO's Pre- and Post Vocabulary Assessment Workshop. I am Brian Geniusz, the Worthington School Science and Health Curriculum Leader.
And I am Jamie Lusher, the English Language Arts Coordinator for the Worthington Schools.
We are here today to better understand the process of the pre- and post vocabulary assessments and the entire SLO evaluation process. Why are we doing SLOs? You can read right here and understand that the Ohio Revised Code clearly defines this through a number of House bills and Senate bills. However, the big thing to take away is that this is the state law. So with that said, how can we make this the best possible outcome for the Worthington students?
Our learning targets for today are the following. First, we would like you to understand the SLO process. Then we're going to help you determine which subjects will require pre- and post tests. We'll be reviewing and applying the test blueprint, which is a resource that the instructional coaches and myself and Brian created as a part of our process. We're going to be able to locate the vocabulary from the curriculum documents and templates that are located on the W Cloud. We'll also be working to create meaningful vocabulary assessment items. We'll also be discussing how SLOs work together with the evaluation system as a part of your student growth measure. And finally, we'll be discussing how to post and retrieve SLO assessment items created by teachers so that you can collaborate and create not only with folks in your department or in your grade level team, but also across the district.
Throughout the presentation, we will have a number of documents that are already posted on the Worthington Cloud. This example will show you where to find them. So if you go to the cloud under My Account, the WOTES, or Worthington Teacher Evaluation System button, will then open you up to a variety of documents. This particular document we're going to go through next is called the SLO Assessment Creation Process. During this process, there are a series of workshops. We're going to start with June 6th or 7th or August 9th or 12th. This is the exact same presentation being presented multiple times, and it's the same presentation that you are now viewing through this video. The hope is to make this opportunity for teachers to not only get the information, but to also collaborate. So if you're able to watch this video and still yet attend one of these workshops, that would be greatly beneficial to you and those around you for collaboration processes. We're really going to work then to create test items, not necessarily a whole elaborate assessment, but single assessment items that can be grouped together to create that assessment. We're going to create those and store those in a test bank. We'll go over how to do that later on in this video.
Many of our teachers sit in non-traditional or support service roles. So teachers that are English language teachers or intervention specialists or other support service areas are having difficulty determining which subjects to create assessments for, who to partner with, and essentially where to start. So one of the things that we're going to talk about in detail is how to make those decisions and how to decide what group of students to target, what grade level to collaborate with, and ultimately how to make this manageable for the work that these folks need to do. But as you think about this as an ELL teacher, an intervention specialist, or support service teacher, think about two pathways. The first would be, this could be a great model for you to collaborate with a targeted grade level or content area. For example, intervention specialists may work with like a third grade reading teacher to develop an assessment that is very, very similar and like, but that is scaffolded to meet the needs of their learners so that they can set realistic growth targets for those kids. On the other pathway, intervention specialists may look at their caseload and target students, focusing on reading goals that are a part of their IEP process, and then monitor student growth as a result of the student's response to the interventions that they are employing through the school year. So there are really two pathways. Our goal is to give you as much information as possible so that you can create what you feel is an authentic assessment, and that gives you a clear pathway of how you're going to measure your student growth. But we'll talk more about this at the end of the presentation. Okay? Ultimately, after you develop your assessment items and you generate an assessment, you are going to administer that assessment to your students. After you administer that pre-test, you will conference with your principal. You need to conference with your principal to discuss the results, to determine if you want to make any adjustments to the assessment, if you'd like to change perhaps the formats of the questions, the types of questions, the number of questions, or perhaps you need to redesign the assessment because your students either didn't achieve very high on it, or perhaps they surpassed the goals that you had set for them. But the goal here would be that you have assessment results, the pre-assessment results, to discuss with your principal. The state has required that you have this completed by September 30th. So you need to have created a pre-assessment and administered that pre-assessment to discuss with your principal by September 30th. As a result, we've discussed with our teachers as a part of our presentation that you may want to think about assessing your students just as soon as we open our doors August 19th, that first week of school. That way you have the largest amount of instructional time to measure your students' growth. It also gives you a lot of time to look at your results from your pre-assessment to determine what you want to share with your principal and how you want to go about setting those goals. After you have your conference with your principal, you're going to continue to employ best practices about round vocabulary. Marzano's protocol, Rosemary Taylor, looking at the Lori Wilfong books and the exemplars that we're going to show you later. Lots of resources that we put together for you to help you in this process to continue to make the instructional practices happening every day in your classroom to support vocabulary growth. After you've had this bulk of instructional time, you're going to post-test your students in the spring. You're going to collect those student results, and you need to have those results finalized and collected and shared with your principal by no later than April 30th. April 30th, again, is the deadline the state gives us because this information is then taken with the observations and the other evidence that your principal has collected as a part of the evaluation process. And that is coupled together to give you one final rating that needs to go into a state database. So the state requires that this SLO assessment, the results, and all that you have documented throughout the school year be intact and communicated with principals by April 30th. So the two big dates here are September 30th, and you have had the pre-test and your conference with your principal. In Worthington, we're going to honor those conferences as what used to be your goal-setting conference. So instead of your traditional goal-setting conference, you'll not only be talking about goals you're setting, but you'll be dovetailing in the SLO and the pre-assessment results. And then you need to have your end-of-year final conference with your principal around the SLO results by April 30th.
It's important to understand which category of a teacher your actual assignment falls under. According to the state of Ohio, there are 3 different categories. The first being category A. Those teachers have value-added results, and that would make up 25% of their student growth measures for their evaluation. And the other 25% will be from this SLO process, pre and post assessments. You'll notice it also speaks to map testing. If you have value added, map test results will count for 0% of the student growth measure. The second group, category B, does not have value added scores, but yet does give map tests. So their SLOs will be worth 40% of the student growth measure, with 10% coming from the map test. Why 10%? By law, that is the lowest possible percentage that the Worthington Schools is allowed to assign this vendor assessment. We would like it to be lower, however, that is the state law. We did not bring MAP into our school district as a teacher evaluation tool, so we want to keep it as minimal an impact into the wrong categories being evaluation, and maximize the right categories being formative instructional practices and formative information about our students' growth.
One thing to remember too is that your principals are going through a new evaluation process as well. It's important to mention that your principals do not have the ability to create an SLO as a part of their student growth measure. Our principals have to use, and they are bound to use, MAP data as well as value-added data. And so they are in the same position where they have now have to use data in terms of a student growth measure that was never brought to the district or intended to be part of their evaluation system. So we're all in this together as we think about how to manage this and effectively navigate to make sure that you are set up for success.
The third category, category C, are for teachers that have no value added and there are no MAP tests that are in existence. The entire 50% of the student growth measures will come from the SLO process. It is also important to remember that there is a proposed bill at this time of recording this video. There is a bill proposed to change this student growth measure from 50% to 35%. We don't know of its progress at this time, but if this were to change, then all these percentages would have to be adjusted accordingly.
A couple questions that we had in regards to the value added piece as well is, well, which value added do I look at? Well, the way the state determines that is value added is value added is value added. It doesn't matter if you taught 4th grade the following school year, and the next year you're teaching 5th grade, and maybe instead of teaching language arts, you're teaching reading. Your student growth measure is linked to you as the classroom teacher for the instructional time for students. So as you think about value added data, think about that holistically when you're thinking about which category you fit in. Another thing to think about too is that our new teachers, the new teachers to Worthington, will not have value added. They won't have MAP data, and they will be a category C, which means that 50% of their student growth measure will be the SLO. So as you think about this process and you wrestle with this question, which subject do I select for my SLO, we want to talk with you about the different options that you have. Because the state would give you some guidelines to say that you would choose the subject for which you teach the majority of your day or the majority of your students. So if you're a high school science teacher and you teach 4 sections of biology, regular biology, and then 1 section of honors biology, the state would say that you could choose just that those 4 biology sections to, again, pre-assess, post-assess, and monitor your student growth, because you'd be hitting the students that you spend most of your day with, and you would have the largest number of your students so that you would be able to monitor student growth. You only choose 1 subject. The subject that you choose does not have to match your value added. So if you're a grades 4th through 8th grade teacher and you have value added in both reading and math, or science and reading, you don't have to choose the bulk of the value added, although you may do so. We gave you an example here in the presentation where we have 70% science and 30% reading as a teacher's value added data. That teacher may really want to focus on those students that she has for reading, because she wants to set specific and realistic goals for those kids and know specifically how she's going to address and make instructional shifts to make sure they're growing. She may target that group of reading kids, and it's a great choice for those kids. Ultimately, what we want to do when you have these discussions with your principal is ask yourself this greater question. What is the best possible assessment to be used for my students? What's the greater good for my kids? And ultimately, what are you going to have in place that will set you up for successfully meeting your goal? So the state will give you some guidelines, but ultimately, as you think about best practice, please have those discussions that you're building with your principal, because ultimately you'll be working through this process collaboratively as a part of the evaluation system with your principal. So again, you do not have to pick the majority of the students or the majority that you spend your time in a specific class. You may target a specific group of kiddos if you feel like it's best practice. That being said, when you think about a caseload of 100 students or a class roster of 100 students, you have a much larger pool of students to demonstrate student growth. If you reduce the number of students that you use to target for your SLO, let's say you pick only 10 students, each one of those 10 students has a larger weight in terms of the student growth that you may or may not get. So think about all of these things as you determine what's going to be the best fit for your school year.
Jamie and I sat down with our instructional coaches and worked out a test blueprint, or an SLO blueprint. It too can be found on the cloud under the Worthington Teacher Evaluation System. The important thing to understand is this blueprint basically sets out the parameters of which we want to follow while creating and administering our SLO pre and post assessments.
It's important to know that as we've thought about this process for our teachers, our goal has really been to, 1, provide a level of support that gives our teachers clarity and help and a possibility of collaboration through this, what can be a very scary process. The other thought was we want to minimize the negative impact that this process could potentially have on instructional practices for students and for our teachers. So as we thought about creating a resource for teachers, many of them ask, get me started. Give me a foundation, give me a framework to think about what this might look like. We wanted to start with where our district has been. And Worthington Schools has been very intentional and very thorough in practice in terms of the professional development surrounding vocabulary acquisition. So as we talk about that vocabulary, we know that vocabulary are more than just words. That vocabulary form the core of conscious operation, the primary pathway the brain uses To trigger and recall stored information is through vocabulary. Hearing or reading a word or phrase allows the brain to access stored information. So we think of those words as triggers. And that's how we tap into the background knowledge of our students. Receptive vocabulary includes the terms and phrases that students recognize and understand. Productive vocabulary includes the terms and words that a student uses. The application of vocabulary skills occur through the reading, writing, speaking, listening, and demonstration processes. So our goal with this blueprint was to create a resource that would safeguard against the best practices and the instructional shifts that we've made historically to ensure that students have access to background knowledge and front loading of before instruction. So we wanted to make sure we maintain the integrity of that while supporting this shift that some of our teachers are going to have to make as we look at the SLO assessments. So this should look very familiar to you. We started with where we've been, and then we started with the vocabulary acquisition protocol. So you see here adapted from Marzano's Building Background Knowledge, Marzano's 6 steps to vocabulary acquisition. You also see on the right-hand side of the screen Rosemary Taylor's vocabulary protocol as well. So these 2 protocols have been intact within our district for the past decade. Learning target. As we think about any instructional practice or any assessment that we'd like to offer for students, ultimately we have to begin with the end in mind. We have to have a clear target for our journey. We pulled this learning target specifically from our English language arts standards. As you know, English language arts now transcends every classroom and every school and every content area. So those reading and writing strands are a part of everyone's content and a shared responsibility. So what you see here is a learning target that our 11th and 12th grade English language arts team developed as they deconstructed this very dense anchor standard. And the learning targets that we thought transcended every classroom, kindergarten through 12th grade, every content area, were the following. I can intentionally build my vocabulary through reading, writing, speaking, and listening. I can independently acquire vocabulary knowledge to understand in reading and listening and to express meaning in speaking and writing. We really thought these learning targets gave that background piece of vocabulary is more than words, and that the truest representation of a child mastering a word or building the vocabulary is their ability to write it, to speak it, to hear, to understand, and do all of those organic processes that our teachers are evaluating and monitoring and formally assessing every single day. So that's where this learning target comes from. You will find these within the curriculum formats, and we're going to show you how to access those on the W Cloud. But again, our foundation here, actually this learning target was developed by your teachers here in Worthington as a part of our curriculum development process. Okay, the vocabulary. We wanted to give you a place to start. Well, where do you begin to think about those very important words that are either barriers or gateways for student learning? And we use these terms Tier 1 and Tier 2 vocabulary. So let's talk about those a little bit. That term comes from Isabel Beck's book and was an anchor piece in the Common Core language. So when we talk about Tier 2 vocabulary, we're talking about those rich academic vocabulary words beyond common everyday language. Okay, those are still words that require very explicit instruction. And we give you some examples here, like distinguish, construct, boldly. These are words that may have multiple meanings and are beyond everyday language. When we talk about Tier 1 vocabulary, those are words that you're going to understand through everyday discussion. Now, Tier 3 vocabulary, these are those content-specific words or domain-specific words. Words like hypotenuse, mitochondria, onomatopoeia, legislature. And research would tell us that we do a pretty adequate job of teaching to those content-specific words because we know they're difficult. We know they're multisyllabic and they're hard for our learners. But what research would also share is that we don't spend enough time explicitly instructing around Tier 2 because those Tier 2 words are often the barriers for many of our students, especially our students that come from impoverished backgrounds, that don't have that full background knowledge for some of those words that need to be rich triggers to the background knowledge that they have. So when you look at the vocabulary piece of this, the vocabulary is derived directly from our curriculum formats. That's a place to start. Your grade level content area teams, grades kindergarten through 12th grade, have collaborated for the past 2 years to develop the Worthington curriculum formats to support our transition to the new standards. As a part of their process, they intentionally broke apart and unpacked very verbose, very difficult standards. Those standards had what they felt were key vocabulary words that were both content specific and academic specific. They specifically pulled those particular words into these curriculum formats and earmarked them or identified them as what we consider to be very important words to instruct around. So these words weren't just placed on the list. There was discussion around these words. There was debate around these words. And our grade level teams in our department spent a lot of time thinking deeply about the importance of these words as their gateways or barriers to student learning. So when you go to the curriculum formats, you may look at that as a resource to start with. Doesn't mean that you have to use all the words that you see there in any of the content or academic boxes, but it does mean that those are words that come directly from the standards, that your colleagues did see as very important for student learning, and may be a place to start. You may find some other words that you feel like are very important as a part of your expertise at your particular grade level that you want to include. You may pare down the list and use only 15 to 20 of those words that you see if you feel like it's too arduous for some of your students, especially if you're a kid if you work with intervention students.
When creating the assessments, we felt it was important that you understand what the new generation of assessments will start to look like in the state of Ohio. This statement, the following types of questions must be reflected in your SLO assessments, really goes back to what we've been told from the PARC assessments and the AIR assessments as the three different types of responses expected from students. If you look at this, it looks very similar to what we've already been seeing through past OAAs and OGT assessments. We want you to take the opportunity to go on these three different websites. There's the PARC assessment prototypes. The AIR assessment would be for science and social studies. And then there's finally some research out there from the University of Oregon, a taxonomy table that will show you from very constrained to very open-ended types of assessment questions that can be on a computer interactive assessment. Please understand, we're suggesting these as types of assessments. I think the statement must be reflected is a little overpowering. We want to make certain that we have high quality vocabulary pre and post assessment items, much more important than simply making certain that we have a multiple choice type question.
And if you refer to just the documents that are being produced as examples from the state, this is the type of language you're going to see. So we want you to be aware that this is what you'll see in some of those resources. But not only these assessments may you use, but there are many other ways that you are constantly assessing vocabulary that we're going to discuss that would be very appropriate options for you to use as a part of your pre and post assessments. But we wanted to make sure that you were very aware of what some of the language looks like around this when you look at any of the documentation that the ODE may provide for us.
It's also important to understand that this is meant to be kept in context with the rest of your class. This is not to take over all the instructional time. We are recommending that all primary level students are not assessed on this vocabulary in excess of 30 minutes for a pre-assessment and 30 minutes for a post-assessment. So you get 30 minutes each. Intermediate, that would boost up to 45, and at our middle and high schools, we would like to constrain that to one classroom period. And these are maximum times that should not be exceeded, not minimum. So it may be more appropriate to assess your primary students in 3 blocks of 10 minutes or total of 10 minutes, long as you feel comfortable that you are assessing that set of vocabulary with your students in that amount of time. Do not take too much time on doing this in your classrooms. And what you can also expect is to see some speaking, listening, writing, performance tasks, reading, or even some other tasks that are available. And we're going to go through in just a minute examples of some high-quality vocabulary assessment items found in research.
And it's important to note that many of our teachers, as a part of our first discussions during the June 6th and 7th sessions, our teachers had great examples and ideas of what they were already using as a part of their formative assessment practices. So much of their time when they spent collaborating to generate their assessment items or the assessments themselves, they're actually looking back at some of the things they already use as a part of their vocabulary instruction. If you're a primary teacher, many of those early literacy things that you use in terms of sight words, letter sound associations, very appropriate because those are the precursory skills for a robust vocabulary. So again, think about what you're doing, think about the performance task or other ways that you're measuring student growth, and then think about this final application piece of what it could ultimately look like at the end of the year. So maybe you want them to be at a place where they're writing a full paragraph or a body of text. Well, where might you start then? So again, don't feel obligated to stick with the language that the state gives you. Think about holistically in your instruction how you're, as a formative part of your instructional practices, assessing students, and think about then what a manageable assessment might look like, including those types of tasks.
As Jamie referenced before, our curriculum writing team spent a great deal of time identifying both content and academic vocabulary for a variety of courses and grade levels. These documents are posted on the portal, and I'll show you that in a second. However, the green text represents all items in these curriculum formats that are to be fluid and dynamic. So as we see vocabulary lists or assessment ideas, that we can still adjust those. Those are not stagnant and fixed, but they are able to change and evolve as our teachers and our students require. Here's an example from science. You can see that we have these posted in a variety of different ways. You can find these documents in a slightly different location. They are also located on the cloud, but go under Documents and Forms. And then on the left-hand side will be the phrase GCOS _ and then the subject. And within that subject, the courses and grade levels are broken down. We are currently still in process of getting all of those posted, but a great deal, actually the majority of all those curriculum formats are already online, and by the time we start school, we expect 100% of the new curriculum formats to be up there in this location. In an effort to help our teachers create meaningful vocabulary assessment items, we've put together a list or examples of research-based best practices in vocabulary. They can be found on the cloud under the My Account, Worthington Teacher, Evaluation System, and this one is SLO Test Examples.
Our goal by creating this resource was to give you a place to start, maybe conceptualize what this could look like within your content area or your grade level. I think it's important to mention, though, what the intention of the document is. So it is very important that you know that we provided this to you as a place to start. The truest measure of building vocabulary is the ability to use words in our writing and our speaking. Vocabulary words are triggers to stored information, and it is the word that connects our existing knowledge with new information. Exposure, modeling, and application of complex vocabulary is a critical component of instruction and assessment for student learning. As Isabel Beck reminds us, students will never use the word saunter if they only hear the word walk. This document contains examples of vocabulary tasks designed to probe the depth and breadth of student understanding. The research was designed to assist writing teams in the development of vocabulary pre- and post-assessments. These are examples to inspire creativity rather than command uniformity. Please build upon and rely on your expertise as a teacher. For example, having students underline or circle unknown words in the directions is an effective way to assess their current Tier 2 vocabulary. More importantly, this practice encourages students to recognize, investigate, and be curious about the words that they do not know. From interest to research and etymology, students should actively seek to build a robust and complex vocabulary on a daily basis.
One example of a vocabulary assessment item is what we call a vocabulary recognition task, or VRT. In this case, the student is simply asked to identify the terms listed that have something to do with DNA replication. Students would simply circle those that have something to do. Sometimes the students would circle something that is not involved with DNA replication, for example, gel electrophoresis. That would be a false positive. There's ways to score this, and those are outlined in the document. If you go to the cloud and find the document itself, there's a couple different ways. The scoring is meant to help identify and take away the guesses from the vocabulary recognition task itself.
Here you see an example of a vocabulary self-assessment. This is a very short example of one type of assessment you might use, but it gives students the opportunity to give you feedback about words that may be foreign to them or unknown. So you see here that you have 4 content-specific vocabulary terms from 5th grade science, And students have the capacity or ability to let you know whether they have heard about this, they've never heard about it, and they have some idea of what this could mean, or they know it very well and would be able to put this as a part, put this definition or an operational understanding within their writing. What we liked about this is it gives students, again, a voice in this. It also allows students that if you do have some challenges in terms of what their growth measure might look like for the year, for example, kids might not be able to master all 50 words on a list. You could pare it down to the specific words that you feel are the most important within every content or concept or unit that you teach. The other piece would be that you are able to scaffold to meet the learner's needs. So it may not be that a student will ever be able to use it in their writing, but they would be able to give you a definition and understanding if you have kiddos that are on a plan that would require them to really focus on some of those high intensity words.
Another vocabulary assessment is a concept sort. What you see here is what we call a closed sort. The students are given a list of terms and then simply asked to categorize them or sort them into one of three categories. This can be scaffolded upwards, for example, by removing the category names and have the students simply get a list of terms and ask the students to sort them into what they feel is the most appropriate categories. You could also increase this. It's also very tempting for students to say, I don't know an awful lot. Our speaker from the Next Generation Learning Leaders Academy on June 5th suggested actually increasing the size of some of these vocabulary assessments and then telling our students very clearly, the next assessment you get will be pared down from the words that you already know. So by showing us you know these words, you will have less and less words to do in future assessments. That seems to be a very good motivator for the students to try their best and give a good quality effort.
Okay, here you see a vocabulary word hunt in writing. We're not crazy about the title because unless you're the assessor, you're not really word hunting. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You're taking key academic or content vocabulary terms, and you're taking those terms and you're actually creating a piece of writing. In this example, students are asked to write an instructional paragraph to teach another student how to make a light bulb light up. They need to make certain that they use the following terms: circuit, closed circuit, open circuit, parallel circuit, series circuit, wire, battery, voltage, resistance, and current. So you can see that that is 10 plus what we consider content-specific vocabulary words or terms that the students need to write about. They need to provide background knowledge. They need to put it within the text that makes sense in a structure that again, is aligned with something that would be instructional. And they need to give background knowledge that needs to make sense, to be coherent. So you can see that this type of task really increases the rigor for students and actually gets into that, what we call that depth of understanding. The fear many times when you assess vocabulary is that it gets kind of washed down to something like vocabulary cards, where you're at a very low level of bloom, simply that knowledge base of understanding. But when you talk about digging into what we call that depth of understanding, it's tasks like this. So the assessor would then look at the piece of writing, go through and make sure that the words are used appropriately, that they're used to describe and instruct another student to be able to light up the light bulb, and that they're also be able to learn from again, the student's writing, the background knowledge that he or she may possess. Now, very easily, this type of task could be done in a verbal way. It could be scaffolded so that there are parts of text that are there to give anchors for kiddos that need some structure and support in their writing. You could decrease the number of vocabulary terms that are used as a part of the task. So you have a lot of options here, but this is a good place to start. Many of our teachers, through our first round of these vocabulary assessment workshops in June 6th and 7th, many of our teachers looked at this as a way to think about the end in mind. Where do I want my students to be? And that's where they started with those high yield words. They started with those key concepts, those key terms, and then ultimately what they wanted their students to be able to do. And many times that was to produce a writing piece, because we know that requires the highest level of blooms. They're synthesizing information and they're evaluating that information, and then they're creating something for you. So this is we felt a very, very good strategy here.
Many of our primary teachers are already familiar with a concept maze used in Ames Web. This simply takes a passage from a informational text and takes out key vocabulary words, replaces it with a blank, and then provides three alternatives or options to be circled for the student to add into that location. You can scaffold this upwards by removing the 3 options and pushing all those words down to a word bank. You could increase the word bank to add some non-used words so it becomes less of a matching. Or even the highest end would be to remove the word bank altogether and the students were to come up with those words on their own. Please understand that all of these assessment items were research best practices, and you can find this entire bibliography along with these examples on the WOTES site in the cloud. These are great primary sources if you want to see additional options for vocabulary assessments. This is SLOs are part of the Worthington Teacher Evaluation System. When we talk about it, we're talking about that 50%, the other 50% being the actual performance as evaluated by your principal. And remember that this 50% is proposed to be changed to 35. We don't, at this point, again, we do not know if that will take place or not. This document is available in its entirety on the cloud under that WOTES site. This is a document that was presented to the school board at the beginning of June, end of May, as to what the entire teacher evaluation system will look like. Not only does it include the SLOs, but it talks about all of the pre and post assessments, the pre-conference, post-conference, the scales, the percentages, all of those details are in this. So if you're interested in more details, I encourage you to go visit the WOTES site and look up these items. We would like all these test items that are created to be banked or put into a Dropbox to allow for great collaboration asynchronously across the entire district. This Dropbox will appear under your account when you sign into the cloud, and then you go under My Files. When you go under My Files, you'll look on the left-hand side there, under your K drive is an SLO Dropbox, as well as the SLO item bank. When you go into the Dropbox, there's a couple different ways to drop these items. You can actually click and drag those under the file uploader, or you can go over to the action button, click, drag down, and go to the upload feature in that pull-down menu. Please note that these are Java dependent, and a warning window will appear that says, do you want to block Java? Please do not block Java, or else you won't be able to upload. When you get those items into the item bank or into the Dropbox, our curriculum team will then sort those into an item bank. We will sort them by subject area and then grade level or course name as appropriate. These two can be found just in My Files under My Account in the cloud. If you look, this is an example of that SLO item bank expanded. You can see where science has been expanded, and you can see a variety of grade levels and courses available. You'd simply click into one of those courses and be able to download items that other teachers across the district have created that are aligned to those sets of standards. To help us with this process, please, please, please remember to name the files with this convention. The subject that it goes with, then the grade or course name, and then a identifying topic. For example, you could say physical science, you could say science, then physical science, then electricity. That would be a great naming convention. That way it allows us to quickly identify them and sort through them, and our teachers to not have to wait as long to make that happen. And finally, I want to make certain that we produce all of these files in Microsoft Word. This is a word processing program that is available to all of our employees in the school district. I know some people like to use some Mac versions, for example, Pages. That is great. Please save it as a Microsoft Word document so it can be used by other people that do not have access to Macintosh computers. At this point, we would pause for questions.
We wanted to bring up, though, a couple of great questions that we had as a part of our first round of the workshops in June. One question was, are there a minimum number of students that I have to put on my SLO to monitor student growth? It's a great question. So we talked about this a little bit earlier in the presentation, that there are two sort of schools of thought on this. One, the law of numbers helps when you think about student growth. So if you have a larger pool of students, then you have a better opportunity to show that student growth. If you reduce numbers of students, you're going to have, again, each one of those students is going to matter a little more in terms of the global or overall weight of performance. So think about that. In terms of state guidelines, they don't really give us any, but we will tell you that for value added, in order to have data, you have to have at least 10 students on your roster. So for many of our teachers, they've kind of thought about that. Well, if I had value added data, I would need at least 10 students. Could I identify or cluster at least 10 kids if I'm an intervention specialist or somebody that sits in a support service role? We had a great question too about SLOs. Won't they eventually go away? Yes, for many of you with the new assessments, you will begin to have what is called value-added data, or data that would give you a student growth measure. So yes, for many folks, the SLOs will go away, but not this year. So it's, again, that's an ongoing conversation and one that we can continue to monitor and provide information. But at this time, SLOs are in place. We need to have the assessments intact and ready to go at the timeline that we talked about earlier in the presentation. But that was a good point. And then beyond that, as you have questions about where do I fit into this entire process, what are areas that I need to really, increase my level of understanding, we are going to be having additional opportunities for you to come and spend time with us. But then also, your principals are going to spend time with you, having some discussions at the building level. So if you weren't able to attend a workshop, and you haven't been able to have discussions with your colleagues, know that the resources are available online, as Brian said, but then we'll also be allocating time. I believe our first day back in the summer, in the afternoon, what would be your PLC time, is actually going to be allocated to folks that could not attend any of the workshops to be able to spend time around the SLO process.
At this time during the regular sessions, we would have been breaking apart into smaller groups and allowing teachers to work in groups and just providing support. I would encourage you to contact people across the district that already have been in attendance of these SLO workshop meetings, as well as people that may not have, and you can sit down and collaborate and start to create good quality pre and post assessment items. The idea is that many hands make for light work, so let's make good quality assessments and use the abilities and skills of all of those around us.
One final thought. What many of our participants at the end of this the session asked, what do I turn in? What do I physically turn into my principal? What do I share with them? The state doesn't require you to turn in the actual assessment that you use, but we know that that's best practice, which is why we've structured the process the way we have. But in terms of what you actually turn in and provide to your principal, you fill out the SLO template, which is on the WCloud and Word document. You create a form that is, again, unique to yourself using that template to, again, address the areas and domains that the state is requiring of you to demonstrate student growth.
Throughout all of this process, remember, we don't want you to simply go somewhere new. We want you to go boldly where no one has gone before.
Thank you.